to Chicago and they go and pedal throughout Chicago. It's phenomenal out there. And to all of the youth that are coming out, a migratory, but that is also a migratory group of people from St. Nicholas, which I'm really excited to hear your stories after the talk as well. A lot of this research has come out of oral history interviews with people from different communities, so it's very much steeped in people's memories, but also mixes of archival research and archival sources. And so this talk comes out of my larger book project, which I'm working on right now, which is actually a history of early Muslim immigration to the Midwest. So looking at not just Syrian and Lebanese, but also Bosnian, Albanian, different groups were coming, but Syrian groups loom large in this early period. I've come across a lot of records on both Syrian and Christian immigration to the Grand Rapids area. So, I haven't done a lot of research on this, so I'm excited to share. Oh, sorry. Can talk with you about it. I'll speak up a little bit more. That's kind of situating where this is. Oh, right, my book is not entirely on Grand Rapids, but it does feature as a place that Syrians are coming and often establishing themselves, establishing churches, as you know, and many of them then
George and Mary's.
Railroads and furniture factories were often then moving on to other centers, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, to Dearborn, to other places in the Midwest, to Toledo in particular, Toledo, Ohio, being a big place for migration. But many came first to Grand Rapids. So there's been quite a lot of work on Syrian immigrants in probably one of the first families, and most of it focuses on their assimilation into American society. And in the narrative, we have, you may have read books or heard stories from your grandparents about how Syrians came through Ellis Island, peddled around the countryside. Many of you may have family who were peddlers, grandparents, great-grandparents, or were, and then opened dry goods stores, then established members of American society. And now they have names like Barbara and Tom and work in HR and insurance. And Syrians are often portrayed as being part of the American dream. But it wasn't always this easy for, a lot of people, otherwise it would have had difficulties as they came into the United States. So the history of Syrians I'm going to talk about in this picture.
They want to share or talk to each other or talk to Dr. Bavery about, and we're open to that. She's available if anybody wants to stay and talk. And I want to thank you again for coming. And if anybody wants to get more information about Pucci office events in the future, we do have this sign-in sheet. Yes, thank you.
St. Nicholas people stay for a picture.
I'm going to talk a little bit some about Christian Syria, but also many settled in Grand Rapids, and why many of them eventually left, returning to Lebanon or continuing on to Dearborn or Toledo, where they started businesses of their own. And so here I want to introduce, I know many of you are very familiar with the concept of Greater Syria. So when I'm talking about, sometimes I'll talk about Syrian immigrants, I'm not talking about people from the country that we now know as Syria. This is the Ottoman province of Greater Syria, which is within the Ottoman Empire right here. Okay, and so here's for context, kind of mapped onto the land here. So, the Greater Syria encompasses modern Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and parts of Jordan as well. So it's this large region that was, at this time that I'm talking about, in the late 1980s, early 1900s, is administered by the Ottoman Empire. And that's going to get shaken up a lot by World War I. So, and I'll talk a little bit about what's going on during World War I. And so, I started finding a lot of records while I was doing research in the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I found a lot of deportation files from inspectors who were trying to figure out what to do with groups of Syrians who were smuggling themselves into the United States. So this is kind of how I'm, approaching some of these records and how I got into this project. And so I'm going to share the story of one of these immigrants who happens to be a Syrian Muslim who's coming into to Grand Rapids, but there were also many Christians who were doing the same, coming in through the same routes in this smuggling journey. And so this man's name is Mohammed Khalid. And in the spring of 1912, Mohammed Khalid was a young Muslim living in the town of Katana, Syria. And he received news from his cousins who were working in Grand Rapids that the Paramarquette Railroad was hiring workers at $2 a day. And this was more than 8 times what Khalid could imagine making in a day of plowing his fields, local fields. So he convinced his friends, Hassan, so he got this crew, he's a young guy, he got this crew of friends, Hassan Hamoudi, Abdul Karim Khatib, and Ahmad Kawada, to accompany him to Grand Rapids. So they all get together, young guys, right? They're getting together, they're going to make this journey. And they hope to make enough money to start a family, and they plan to return home to Syria. They weren't planning to stay in the United States, they planned to return back. And they're also hoping perhaps to avoid the Ottoman draft as well. So they're young guys. And so the men, all of whom were in their early 20s, boarded a ship from Beirut to Marseille. And once in France, so here's this is just a source. This is basically a middleman who's helping Syrian migrants get to Marseille. So this was a business card from a smuggler, not a smuggler, but kind of a man you'd have to contact once in Marseille to get your ticket after that. So there was this kind of invisible yet very kind of understood route that migrants would take, and they learned about this through word of mouth from friends, letters home, things people told them. And so once the group got to Marseille, they were not allowed to come into the city because the French were so panicked about, they thought that Syrians and people from the Eastern Mediterranean areas were diseased, particularly with cholera. And so they quarantined them. They were all quarantined on this Ile de Froil, which is a little archipelago. It's not actually one island. It's a small archipelago right off the coast of Marseille. And you can actually go to the quarantine office where they would have had to stay.
Sorry, it's an issue with the projector bulb.
Okay, it's coming so it's right here, see. They would have come over here by ship. They had these kind of small steamships they would have taken from Beirut to Marseille, and then would have been on this, quarantined in this kind of old castle that was set up as a hospital on this island. But ironically, by staying here, they were cramped in with each other, and they were more likely to get diseases while in quarantine on the Ile de Froil than they were back where they came from, in their villages, or even on the ships they came from. So many of them actually picked up things like eye diseases, like trachoma, which was something that could eventually lead to blindness, or they picked up, there weren't actually that many outbreaks of cholera. That was overblown, kind of paranoia from the French authorities, but there was a lot of disease coming out of this island. And at this time, Ellis Island officials, so some of them then went on to Ellis Island, right? They took ships to New York, but a lot of Ellis Island officials had started to exclude Syrians, both Christian and in particular Muslims, but both, because they thought that they carried disease, particularly the eye disease I mentioned before, trachoma, and for Muslims they would ask them about polygamy, even though most migrants were not, they were not practicing polygamy in their villages, but that was a question that Ellis Island officials would ask and exclude many people for. And so they decided, this group decided, because of that, they were worried they might get rejected at Ellis Island, and so they decided to go through Mexico. And this was a very common route, and turned into a but there's not a lot of photographic or images that come with some of this story. A lot of it's kind of being uncovered right now by historians. They took a ship then from Marseille to Veracruz, right here, right there, which was right there. And the young men did this because they thought they might be able to get around immigration laws, but also more importantly, they thought they could visit friends who they actually had in Mexico. So one of the things was that there was this, during the 1890s and the early 1900s, many of you may know, but not everyone, that there's a huge out-migration from the Syrian, particularly the region now known as Lebanon, to the United States, but also to all of South America and to Mexico. So, and many people would get to Marseille and would say, I wanted to get to America, and the agent would say, which place? They said, well, I don't care, right? I just want to go to America. And then not everyone, to them America was a large kind of undifferentiated land unless they had specific family in a specific place, right? So many people would go to Argentina, to Cuba had a very large Syrian population, and so did Mexico. So this group were like, well, one of the guys had a friend in Mexico City, so let's just go to Mexico, we'll visit my friend, he can connect us with people, and then we'll continue on. So once they so they get to Veracruz, they get in just fine, which was good for them, and then they go to Mexico City, and they spend a couple of weeks in Mexico City, living in the Syrian colony there, which was known as the Colonia de Turcos at the time, and then they decided to proceed to the United States. And so they headed up to the border, right up here, and then north here, to Nuevo Laredo. And here's a picture of the border crossing and Nuevo Laredo, the bridge, in the early 1900s, just to give you an idea of what their plan was. So at the border, they get to the border and get across, and U.S. immigration officials reject all 5 of them, summarily. Two of the men received a diagnosis for the eye infection trachoma, and the remaining 3 faced the rejection under the likely to become a public charge law, which was a law that inspectors could use kind of arbitrarily to reject anyone they thought might need state assistance within 5 years of entering the United States. So anyone that looked like they might be poor, that any reason really, right? As long anyone they thought could be poor, could have a disease. They would say anyone that looked like they were quote-unquote feeble-minded as well. So this was all written into the language of the immigration laws. And so they would reject it that way. But the likely to become a public charge law gave immigration inspectors a lot of discretion. So they could kind of decide, well, you look like you might become a public charge, and it's not something you can really argue with, right? So it was something that inspectors used to reject particularly Syrians who they didn't really have another reason of rejecting necessarily. They couldn't find a disease, they often used that. And so news of the men's exclusion soon reverberated through the Syrian community of Grand Rapids, where there were at this time about 200 Muslim migrants who were living and working in the city. And they were worried that their cousins, brothers, and wives might also be included in the border. So they didn't necessarily know these men, but they felt a kinship with them because they also hoped to maybe bring family, thought it could be them. And so Khalid soon took up, Khalid's cousin soon took up a collection among the local community, and Muslim Syrians opened their pockets and enlisted a local grocer, Said Zara, who is a Syrian with Mexican connections, to travel south and help the 5 men get across the border. So he heads south, Said Zara heads south down to, they're at the border in Rio Laredo, and he brings the money south and heads back, and he's gonna help them get across. And so they tried 2 more times to get across the border. They're rejected both times, and then finally, they head up further north and cross at Nogales into Arizona and are able to cross there by they actually give Christian names to cross. So kind of showing how they're, trying to show that they're, they give, I forget what the names are, they're like John Smith or something. They're very generic names that are obviously not their names, but they change their names and are able to get across. And so this migration network, which was facilitated by Khalid and his friends, helps this unauthorized entry into the United States. And it tells us a few things about this migration. So let's just, okay. So one, we see that there's this large migration of Syrians who are coming across the U.S.-Mexico border at this time. And I've come across countless thousands of documents that talk about Syrians coming across the border. There are many people who are moving back and forth. There are merchants going back to Mexico and throughout South America, and Syrians who are crossing both legally and as undocumented immigrants across the northern border. And we also see here that Grand Rapids has this robust Syrian Muslim and Christian community. So while the Christian community is much larger, I'll talk about that in a minute, but often overlooked is that there's this beginning, we see the beginnings of a Muslim migration. And we also, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Syrian Muslims and Christians as well are forging ties with local Mexicans. So that's something that we see in a lot of these Midwestern towns. I see it in Toledo, in Cedar Rapids, in Michigan City, Indiana. In towns that had large Syrian populations, a lot of Syrians are living alongside and marrying Mexican women in particular, and leading lives, often because they've spent a lot of time in Mexico through their migration, visiting friends. So they're coming, it's not just that they're coming and living next to Mexican immigrants, they're, they have this kind of background and history with Mexican migration. All right. Let me talk a minute about, here's the Syrian Midwest I want to introduce a little bit before I get to Syrians in Grand Rapids in particular. So these are some of the places that have the largest Syrian communities, both Christian, Orthodox Maronite, and Muslim. Okay. Sioux City, Iowa, and Cedar Rapids, Iowa have very large Syrian communities, and then soon Michigan City, Indiana, Grand Rapids, Highland Park, Michigan, and Detroit, so soon to be Dearborn, but this time in the late 1890s to the early 1900s. Most Syrians are moving to Highland Park, working at Ford in many cases, then opening shops and stores in other areas. And also Toledo, Ohio. Many people from Grand Rapids actually would move to Grand Rapids, work for a little bit, and then move on to, particularly to Toledo and to the Detroit region, or the other way around, right? So there's a lot of migration within these regions that I'm finding. So that, you know, when I'm talking about Grand Rapids, it's hard to talk about Grand Rapids without talking about kind of the greater Midwest that people are moving around in. And in particular, women are moving around because they're marrying between some of these places, right? So a lot of women are forging ties between these communities because they're the ones marrying into them. I also hear that there's someone from who has family from Spring Valley, Illinois, which is a name that comes up a lot as a major center for Syrian immigration. So there's a lot of these Midwestern towns had Syrian immigration, and a lot of it has to do with the places a lot of them are railroad hubs. So a lot of people are coming and working on the railroads. In Michigan City, Indiana, they're building railroad cars at Pullman Railroad, and so they're dealing with that. And in particular, here, I'm looking, this is just a picture of Grand Rapids. I don't have a picture of Little Syria in Grand Rapids, but Little Syria in Grand Rapids, by 1920, had a large Syrian community. Between 1,000 to 1,500 Syrians is the estimation. It's hard to know because a lot of the Syrians living here were young men who were often peddlers. They're moving around the countryside or moving back and forth between all of these places for jobs. So they don't get caught by the 1920 census kind of properly, and are often maybe not at home. They're living in boarding houses. So a lot of the census data is kind of estimations, but historians estimate that between 1,000 to 1,500 Syrians are living in Grand Rapids, and so they're part of this huge migration that's coming to the Midwest. About 80% of the migrants from Syria coming to the Midwest are Christian, and we see that in Grand Rapids as well. Probably about 80 to 90% of the Syrian immigrants are Christian, about 10 to 20% are Muslim, depending on the year too, depending on who's here, who's moving. And we also, so 1,000 to 1,500 Syrians, probably about 1 to 1.5% of the population. So not a huge part of Grand Rapids' population, but not tiny either, right? You know, fairly large, enough to be noticeable. Many Syrians came, and the first things that they're, I'll talk a little bit about where they're coming from as well. So most of these early Syrians were Orthodox, Antiochian Orthodox Christians from the Bekaa Valley. Also there were a handful of Melkites and Maronite Christians, not so many, and about 200 Muslims coming, most of who were young men. The Orthodox tended to bring families over, and at first, all of the young migrants, whether they, from whatever group they came from, crowded into boarding houses and rentals on the east side of the river, just north of the city center. And this was an area between Market Street and West Division Street, if you can kind of imagine it. And they crowded into boarding houses here and kind of cheap housing, apartment complexes, because it was inexpensive, and it was where they could find a place to live when they first got to the city. It was subject to flooding because it was so close to the river, and they lived in these regions alongside Italians, African Americans, and Mexicans as well, who were coming all for jobs in this area. And many who are coming over are working as peddlers. This is kind of the iconic story of the Syrian immigrant. So there were large wholesale retailers that were owned by wealthy Syrians and Turks in Chicago, and in particular in Dearborn, Detroit as well. And they provided newcomers who couldn't speak very much English often with goods, sometimes lace, thread, ribbons, rosaries, items they said were from the Holy Land. They'd give them water and say, tell people this is from the Holy Land, so they go around. And sometimes there were a handful of women who peddled, then went door to door to people's houses. You start out probably with a pack on your back, but peddlers also often brought wagons along as a peddler. This is Cedar Rapids, Iowa. This is from the NAF collection. And there are a lot of really good photos of peddlers from Cedar Rapids. And then some peddlers, this is another Iowa, he's in Urbana, Iowa. This guy. Here. So Abe Aussie, and he is in Urbana, Iowa, and he's got a truck, right? So not what you imagine a peddler is, right? But same idea, he's going around to different farms, and he's going across the Iowa countryside, into Native American reservations, and peddling goods. So on his own, this was a very lonely life, it's really difficult, right? So, and on a smaller scale, men would just go door to door, local, to local regions. But a lot of the peddling work was done to bring goods to local farms, and local farmers depended on peddlers both for news and someone to talk to, but also a little excitement, but also for goods. So it was an important part of the market during this time period. But not all Syrians coming over were peddlers. And if you look in the census on even just in Ancestry.com, you can look up the census. A lot of Syrians working in Grand Rapids in particular were working in furniture factories. So they're furniture workers. I'll show you some census things in a minute. And a huge number were railroad workers, actually. Particularly some of the people who, and some of the laborers who come here and are living in Grand Rapids are often the people then who moved on to other places. Many of the peddlers were able to kind of get ahead and establish dry goods stores in the city, so then maybe you hear their stories more. But a lot of the people would come, young men would come, work in factories and on the railroads, and then would go on to a different city in the Midwest, maybe, or also they would go back to Syria, bring money back to their family, buy a big house, buy some land back in, and kind of get married, have enough for a dowry for children, things like that. All right, and here are the railroad workers. Many worked on the Paramark Railroad outside Grand Rapids and the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so these are some of the things that Syrian immigrants were doing when they came to the United States and to Grand Rapids. They also opened grocery stores and pool halls. So I don't have any pictures of local grocery stores in Grand Rapids. I have a lot of things from Iowa, so this is a grocery store in Cedar Rapids that is owned by a local a Syrian man, but this is his wife at the store, in the 1920s. But many Syrians who had been peddlers, you might maybe started with a pack, then you got a wagon, then you got a truck, and then you opened a dry goods store. That was kind of the hook. And a lot of people were in urban centers, but they were often spread across little towns in the Midwest, because you would find somewhere that needed a store, and you would open it, somewhere in Urbana, Iowa, and all these tiny little towns often had a Syrian grocer, and then they would travel back to the larger town then to go to church or the mosque, or to just be friends with people and talk to people, to speak Arabic as well. They also opened pool halls and pool rooms as well, something that was, and in Toledo, bars as well. So these were all things that were small businesses in many cases. All right, and in the early 1900s, we see a group of these Syrians, Orthodox Christians, get together, and they teamed up actually with the local Greek Orthodox Church to buy the land and build a church for $3,200, which was a lot in 1909. And they founded and held the first church service in 1909. This is not the first church service, this is a wedding.
That's actually Cass Avenue. That's actually not.
Oh, then that's mislabeled in the archives then. Interesting. Okay, I'll get.
That's Cass Avenue.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is in the Grand Rapids Public Library archives.
It's
labeled as
understandable why they
St.
got mixed
George.
up when
Yeah.
you talk about that, but it's understandable. It's a complicated story.
Well,
You're close enough for it.
no, thank you. Yeah, so it's labeled under as the original church. But thank you.
St. George is the best.
The later one. Okay.
That's the later building.
Okay. So the original church was founded in 1909. This was the later building. Thank you. But the early services were elaborate and held in Arabic and Greek, so together, because again it was joining the local Greek Orthodox and Syrian Orthodox community, and they lasted between 2 and 2.5 hours usually. So it was. And also, so scholarship on the region says that there are probably between about 100 Muslims in Grand Rapids. Other primary sources from the time say there probably was closer to about 200. So, and it's hard to say because they're young men who are moving around, often going back and forth between the United States and Syria. But many of these are not Muslim Syrian railroad workers. These are just railroad workers in Grand Rapids. But just showing, I don't have any pictures of them. Just showing that most of them did work on the railroads when they're coming here. And they're often moving seasonally around to different places. Said Zara, the man who if you remember, was the man who went down to Mexico and helped the five guys get across. He was the most kind of upstanding member of the local Muslim community, and he ran a grocery store in the town. So, and was good friends with the local Christian Syrians as well. So there was a lot of kind of connection, and people would go to have banquets together and dinners and speak Arabic together as well, because remembering kind of the homeland was very important for people, especially when they got to Grand Rapids or to other places in the Midwest. And one thing I found, and there's particularly Syrian Muslims, because they often didn't have a church that they're establishing at this time. They didn't have, there was a mosque in 1921 that was established in Highland Park, but that fell apart after a few years. Most of them are actually establishing mutual benefit societies, which are kind of local societies, kind of like insurance that young men would pay into, and that would give them some sort of benefit. It would, if someone died, it would give them a funeral benefit. If you got sick, you would pay each other's health insurance, and they would also help with immigration issues. So that was part of probably these men who were taking the collection to help the five guys cross the U.S.-Mexico border, were part of Grand Rapids' Mutual Benefit Society, and they were kind of helping each other. And this was very common for immigrant communities. Italian groups had mutual benefit societies. Also, churches often filled this role as well. And some of these actually did turned into mosques, but they started, and these are the Syrian Muslim Society in Grand Rapids is something that the men talk about in the records. So it shows that there's organization in this group. They're not just kind of going back and forth. And Sioux Falls and Michigan City, Indiana had one of these, as did Cedar Rapids, and then this is actually a mutual benefit society for young Bosnian men. So in Chicago. But it wasn't not everyone was just helping each other as well. A lot of these relationships could turn exploitative. I found in the records that to get work at the Pere Marquette Railroad in particular, often young men would have to pay a middleman who was also a Syrian sometimes from their same background or religion, sometimes opposite or different, and they would have to pay the person off to get a job. So there was, in particular in Grand Rapids, the men are complaining that they had to pay off Khalid Abu Sunrise. I can't see it flickering back and forth. To get a job at the Pere Marquette Railroad. And he was kind of in charge and knew about the jobs, right? So these were, he was Christian. Right, so he was the person they had to pay to get the job. Oh, so you know him?
No, a lot in Grand Rapids.
Oh, I see, right. So they had to pay him to get the job at the railroad. So they were complaining about it. So they could, had to deal with these things. And we also see that Syrians are having a lot of connection with the small but growing Mexican community in Grand Rapids as well. So Syrian Muslims and Christians are living and often working alongside other non-white immigrants. And it's often giving them an identity as someone that's kind of in between, right? They identify as white, sometimes not quite white, other times depending on who they're with and who they're kind of dealing with. And the local press often reinforce this idea. And the Grand Rapids Gazette would often call Syrians swarthy followers of the Prophet Muhammad, no matter whether they were Christian or Muslim. So there's this kind of Orientalist kind of language that talks about a lot of Syrians, making them feel like they don't quite fit in often. And we see a lot of, something that interested me is in the census, you see a lot of Syrians who are, this is just a couple of examples of Syrians who are living next door to and in the same community as Mexican immigrants. So showing that these are, so here is a group of Mexicans living right next door in the same apartment building as a Syrian family, and here as well. And it doesn't mean that they chose that, maybe it was because they were dealing with the same economic circumstances, but they were, they had some sort of neighborly relationships. You know that they're living side by side. You may know some of these people. We also see that they're living in many cases alongside African Americans in this region. And this is at a time that the African American population is growing exponentially in Grand Rapids. So just to give you an idea, in 1910, there were 659 African Americans in the city, and by 1930, that number had jumped to 2,795 in the census. It was probably larger. And most of, this is a school in 1920 from the Grand Rapids Public Library, just showing you that the schools are mixed, right? So they're integrated. African Americans are going to school alongside white children and often working alongside them. This will change a little bit as neighborhoods kind of solidify over the next couple decades, but this is at a time that, so you see there, and Syrians are also living in many cases alongside African Americans in, well, this will show you that they're living alongside. I wanted to show you some of the records here, but you see people coming from Syria and they're living alongside Mexicans, but also alongside African Americans. And another thing I found in the records is a lot of Syrians are married to to Mexican immigrants as well. So they're, and something that I found was, oh, that's interesting. Maybe they're, in some cases, they're meeting people in their neighborhoods, but also what I'm finding is that they meet people on their migrations through Mexico, because they're living, they're migrating to, okay, they're coming through these regions, and Veracruz, Tampico, Mexico City, and in particular Torreon in Mexico, all have very, very large and robust Syrian settlements, Syrian colonies, and there was a lot of interchange, a lot of Syrians married Mexican women. There weren't that many Syrian women in some of these places, And so then they brought them north, particularly in 1910 when the Mexican Revolution broke out. So a lot of Syrians who lived as merchants in Mexico had no plans to leave Mexico. They had actually been encouraged to come by Porfirio Diaz under his administration before the Mexican Revolution. He had given Syrians preferential kind of visa and economic status because he wanted them to he thought they were white immigrants who were going to come and kind of build the economy. And this all changed during the Mexican Revolution. A lot of the rebels had very anti-foreign kind of ideas, and there were a lot of massacres in particular. So one of the places that a lot of Syrians lived was Torreon, and a lot of the Torreon massacre actually massacred 1,500 Chinese migrants living in the city. But we see this huge influx of Syrians leaving the city as well, because they're worried that they'll be next, right? And they're dealing with anti-foreign sentiment. So a lot then moved north, and I see some then moving to Grand Rapids and across the Midwest, where a lot of them already had family. So, these are people who they weren't using Mexico as kind of a backdoor. They were moving to Mexico because they planned to live there. And then, as economic issues changed, they moved north. And some of them had to do so through the smuggling industry. So they had to, some of them could not get across because of anti-Syrian immigration practices at the border. So they had to smuggle themselves across or pay smugglers to bring them across, which is more likely. And we also see that during World War I, a large number of Syrians they already have ties in Mexico, right? They have family in Mexico, friends in Mexico, and they start to use that to evade the draft during World War I. So these are some records that I actually came across in the Henry Ford archives. There was a middleman, a Syrian man, who was helping Syrian immigrants cross south across the border to avoid the draft, basically during World War I. A lot of men didn't want to have to go back to. They were worried if they went back to the Ottoman Empire and fought against the Ottoman Empire, then they wouldn't be able to hold their land or rejoin with their family. They just didn't want to get involved, right? And so a lot of it wasn't that they were being anti-American. They just were worried about their stability, their family, trying to kind of figure out. They didn't want to deal with this war that they didn't know how it was going to turn out, right? And they didn't want their families to be persecuted in Ottoman Syria either. And so they fled south to some of these various cities in Mexico. And so this, we find that Syrians have, these are some census records in Grand Rapids, and it shows, if you can look at them for longer, you'll see that there are examples of Syrian men who are married to Mexican women who they met on some of these journeys back and forth. So we see this kind of interplay, and a lot of communities, and a lot of the people that I've talked to in some of the different communities will say, oh yes, I did have an uncle who spoke Spanish and lived in Mexico, and it was, we called him Uncle Jose, but he would, and then he eventually went back to Mexico. So there's this kind of story that of ties between the Syrian community in the in the Midwest and in Mexico that you see coming out here. I'll wrap up a little bit as we move forward. And I also wanted to bring up this record, which is a really interesting, if you look through some of the records in the Grand Rapids Public Library. So these are the records from the, let me see the name of the, this is the Women's Committee on the Council of National Defense, which is basically women were registering to work for national defense during World War I. And so, and there were a number of Syrians in this record, and this one in particular shows how this woman, you see her name's Lizzie Matto here, or Mallow, it's not exactly sure, I think it's Matto. She gives us her name, but it says that she's illiterate, she can't read and write. So that means that the person that was from the committee was taking down her notes and her records, and she notes that this person is not white, is colored. And that again shows that in many cases, Syrians maybe saw themselves as white, saw themselves probably just as Syrian or from their village in many cases, but they were seen as, in many cases, as not white from the local community. So in other places where you see people giving their own, kind of identifying their own race, they were usually identified themselves as white. And so it's important to note, this is in these records are in 1910, Syrians did not actually gain the ability to legally become citizens, white citizens, until 1915 with Dow versus the United States, which was a case that went to the Supreme Court. This is a Supreme Court case that officially decided that Syrians were white. But until then, many Syrians occupied this kind of liminal space between white, not white, were often categorized with Mexicans, with African Americans, depending on where they were, their economic status. So they're really occupying this kind of middle space in society. And a lot of people are viewing them, particularly Anglo-Saxon white people are viewing them as non-white, as not part of the mainstream. So that's something you see coming out in some of the records, which is interesting. And here we see, I know that this is not the original building, that I know.
No, this one.
Yes.
Oh, that one is, okay.
But it was, it is, but it.
No, not, right?
Yes, the front part.
This I know is not, but this, I added this because I knew. But we see that some of the legacies of Syrian immigration is often seen in both the architecture and the institutions that they're building in Highland Park and in Detroit. We see some of the earliest mosques in the United States, and Cedar Rapids as well, one of the earliest mosques in the United States being erected. And also here we see St. George in Grand Rapids, and then St. Nicholas, which is established. I know this is not the original building in 1923. And then also there's a St. George in Cedar Rapids as well that's established in 1914. So we see these early institutions which continue on. And it's important to note that religion often mattered less in these early years. So many of the people I've talked to, particularly from the early Muslim community, will say, yeah, of course, we hung out with all the Christians, right? Who else we're going to hang out with? They spoke Arabic, right? We like the same, we also like garlic. And they're often celebrating, having banquets together and celebrating things together in these communities. So this is a Christian and Muslim community having a 4th of July celebration in 1923 together, which was the Orthodox Christian community and the Syrian Muslims, and the Muslim community told me very proudly that they paid for the bell for their church, right? So they had a lot of kind of interaction and respect and friendship that carried across, which is something I've seen in various communities, particularly in the early generations. That was very important to him establishing these communities as both cultural spaces and also spaces that had various religious backgrounds. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to end on that. So the idea that Grand Rapids was an important spot for establishing a early Syrian community And we can see that in some of the buildings and the institutions that are built, but it also represented a stopping place that many migrants took on their journeys to other places that made it an important place. So many of the immigrants who later went on to be part of the Cedar Rapids community or the Toledo community first lived and worked on the railroads in Grand Rapids and vice versa as well. So again, there's a lot of migration, and just because someone didn't live in Grand Rapids and establish a store that had a lasting long-term impact on the city, it was still very important for the larger Syrian community in the greater Midwest. So I'll end there and take any questions you guys have about the Syrian community, or any comments or corrections that you have as well. Local stories, things that fit in. Yes.
I want to thank you for your presentation. Very interesting. It resonated in a lot of ways with me because my grandfather got denied at Ellis Island because of Chuck Nolan.
Yes.
And wound up going to Montreal. We never really did find out how he joined his brothers in Pittsburgh 7 years later.
Yeah.
But we always
I have
figured
some.
it.
I have some suspicions.
Yeah,
Right?
right. I always thought so. My great-grandmother, as a woman, did peddle somewhat, and she sold what she marketed as Middle Eastern lace. Some of the key figures in our church history, Metropolitan Anthony Bashir, Archbishop Anthony Bashir, spent time in Mexico in the 20s before he came to the States in the 30s. Father John Estefan, who was the priest at St. George's for many years, was from Mexico, a Lebanese Mexican that came. Our current bishop, Anthony Michael's grandfather, came to the Upper Peninsula to work on the railroads. So a lot of things that you mentioned resonated. One thing that I would take a little issue with, that you mentioned on the First World War and the draft, and avoiding the draft, was at least a number of the Christians actually wanted to enlist.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Because it was a path to citizenship, for one thing. They didn't really have any love lost with the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
And they also had that kind of Wilsonian self-determination to reform their own country, Lebanon or Syria, out of it. The suggestion that I make, just one session, is that you study Cedar Rapids and Grand Rapids in contrast. And I'll be curious if anybody else has anything in comments on this, because in Cedar Rapids, there's both the Orthodox Church in our diocese, like us, and there's still a mosque that formed that. And in Grand Rapids, we're still here. But I honestly don't know whatever became of that early Muslim community, which I know did work in the roundhouse and railroads. And to me, there's not a trace of that, that we can recall. So I think that'd be an interesting contrast out of those two things. Development. Maybe it's the proximity to Detroit and Toledo.
Yeah, I think a lot of people went to Detroit and Toledo because with the pull of a larger community.
That may be what it, but why Cedar Rapids, which is kind of unique, is it's a little Midwestern city that has both traced there. Finally, I want to mention is we also have a church in El Paso.
Oh, yes.
And I always wondered about how it got to El Paso. And now I'm thinking it's because of all the people that got stuck
I'm
in the
sure.
border.
There were a lot of people who would have crossed and then said, well, this is good enough, right?
Good enough, right? So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Yeah, no, I do want to, there were a huge number of Syrian Muslims who did, Syrian Muslims and Christians who did enlist and be during World War I and World War II as well. So there's a large literature on that it was just, I noticed in some of the records that there are people who were using their connections across the border, kind of to cross in the opposite way, right, which is kind of interesting.
I also have cousins in Argentina.
Oh, cool, yeah.
And had an uncle we called Joe Castro, which was really not his name.
Did your research show that a lot of the Middle Eastern went to Australia as well, and Canada?
Some to Canada, yes. I haven't seen as much to Australia, but I'm sure there is. Yeah, no, it's Brazil I've seen. Yeah, Brazil, Argentina, Cuba as well. All of those, and then some of those people end up leaving Cuba during the revolution. So, yeah.
Which church did you say that there was like Syrian food, like the combination?
That was the early church here. St. George was established as the first one, right? St. George. Yeah, was the.
Yeah, that never panned out. It was their original.
Oh, with their
thought. There was
original
a smaller
intent,
Greek
yeah.
community, And they thought originally, well, we'll go together with the Greeks, but that experiment didn't last very long. And
We understand each other.
yeah, although we use Greek in our liturgical services, because actually we use Greek before we use Arabic, which is another story. Arabic doesn't come in until the later Muslim movement is where we came from in Syria and Lebanon. Prior to that, they used Greek liturgical. So we use Greek in the service still to this day. But that, the Greek thing just didn't, it was a nice idea. And then they got their own church.
My grandfather came from Lebanon through Mexico,
Yeah.
and then to Bismarck, North Dakota, and there's still family there.
Yeah, those like North and South Dakota had large populations. A lot of people got homesteads there or lived in the town, which must have been such a contrast moving from Lebanon and the Mediterranean to North Dakota, South Dakota, right? Trying to work the land would have been really difficult. Yeah.
How difficult is it, or was it for you in doing the research, when the immigrants would come in and their names were changed?
Yeah.
And then being able to keep a Christian name for their first name and maybe their, Arabic last name. What did you find when you were doing that research?
It's difficult. Often I'll follow people more through family histories first, or I'll talk to people, or I've visited different mosques and churches and gone through records and found kind of important people in communities, and then gone through, what their names were, and you just have to be kind of creative as to how they might have changed them, or they'll inverse first name, last name, back and forth often, or often, and usually have a Americanized first name, like Joe, and then often Americanized last name too, right?
Most Christians have already.
A Christian name, right? So it was a lot easier, but the last names also they'll change, right? Just to make it more kind of understandable. And so anyone named Sam, Joe, often who is running a dry goods store in some of these small towns, they'll often be from Syria. You can kind of follow them. And it's hard to know where people come from either when it's census takers are often are categorizing everyone as Syrian, who even people that might be Turkish, who might be from other places later on, right? Anyone that they think looks of Arab descent, they're categorizing often as Syrian. And the people aren't really necessarily interested in correcting them either. So it's hard. So documents are difficult and flawed. Yes.
Well, Donna over here and Dee, they have relatives in Spring Valley.
Yeah.
My mother came from Spring Valley.
Yeah,
And my grandfather and uncles were peddlers in all the small towns. And then they eventually opened up a dry goods store, just like you said.
Yeah, it was a common trajectory. Oh, I'm sure.
Yes. Our mother's family came through Ellis Island and then gradually immigrated to Toledo, so they were part of developing, the Orthodox Church in Toledo, St. George's, but they were peddlers as well. That's how they started out. And then we also know of, it's not related on our side, but we had a cousin in town, and her dad's brother, when he came to Ellis Island, also had the eye infection, got rerouted to Brazil, and lived his whole life in Brazil. And so this gentleman's grandson later on found communication with my Aunt Jean, Jean Philippi. She was Jean Alberts and then became Jean Philippi. And he found her address, and so later on he came to Canada and they reconnected. And it's just wild to think about him, the younger brother ending up in Brazil and essentially living his whole life there.
Yeah, how did they communicate then? In English or?
I don't really know.
Arabic, I wonder. I bet it was in
Yeah.
I've seen stories of people you know, speaking Arabic with a Spanish accent and English with, or Arabic with an English accent and, you know, communicating because they both learned it from their parents, you know.
So when they, okay, obviously the Middle East is a little warmer than Grand Rapids and Iowa have winter time. So I'm thinking they came over, or unless they came up, they just dropped Grand Rapids, went a little further, Spring Valley, and said, okay, I'm not going any further. Kept going and kept going to Iowa and saying, I'm not going any further. Some went further to get to California, but what, how did they decide where to just land?
One of the big reasons was they followed the railroad.
Yeah, follow the railroad tracks.
Yeah, so they would take to a lot of the places that, and then they would say, well, this town needs, or this town already has a Syrian community or needs some stores, right? So they would often find a place that was convenient. There's a fairly, sizable group of Syrian families were in like Fort Dodge, Iowa, in the middle of, which seems like it's in the middle of nowhere, but they followed the railroad tracks and opened up stores and then became successful and continued.
And if you were peddlers, you had every incentive to go where other people weren't.
Exactly,
Like you wanted to be the peddler where nobody else was, and then they had networks. And they would almost like send you, hey, nobody's up here, go there, and you connect with it. Yeah.
Right, so it was a very, which is different than, I've studied some of the, there's a Palestinian group of immigrants that come over in the early 1900s, and they come to Chicago and stay in the one community. They don't move around, right? And the Bosnians come to northern Chicago and live in North Chicago and stay there and work and establish themselves there, but they don't. And the Palestinian Christians as well are to Chicago and they don't move. And they even peddle throughout Chicago, but not beyond there. So it is unique to this group in particular. It's very migratory, but then it's also migrating across North and South America as well, which is really interesting.
I thought it was very interesting you talk about Syria, but you don't mention Lebanon.
Yeah.
And I remember my grandmother would really rail against anybody who called her Lebanese.
Yeah, yeah.
And she migrated from Damascus into the Baca Valley with her Shia. And then Jidda went back to the old country and got her, brought her over. And that's the way they were established. I was raised on Division Avenue in Grand Rapids. I was born on Sheldon near Buckley, and my father had a business on Division, and that was a Middle Eastern ghetto, and they're mostly Syrians, and then the Italians took over at Pleasant, and the Italian ghetto. We went down to Goodrich, and then the Greeks were down around Goodrich in those days.
Yeah, I know, it's so interesting how there were these different groups, yeah. Yes.
Our grandparents also had their names changed.
Right, oh, right, at Ellis
Grandfather
Island, yeah, that was common for
Abdullah,
a person
and
to
he
say.
was named George.
And actually.
And our grandmother was Skandinavia, which means Alexandria, but she was named Mary. So George and Mary's.
Mary was a go-to name when they wanted to change it.
That's right, especially with something like Skandinavia.
Yeah.
Yes.
My uncle married my aunt, she's related by blood to me. His family came in the 1800s.
Oh,
And I have a record of it.
Wow, that's so interesting, yeah.
So they married somebody from Greater Syria, Syrian too. So they probably be here before the Iraq.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the first families.
Yeah, and eventually, the Zania family is well known in Greater Syria.
Yes.
And eventually, my aunt and uncle, she was a working woman. She had the grocery store where Spectrum Hospital right now, the parking lot.
Oh.
That's her grocery store and her house.
Oh.
She sold it to the hospital.
Probably did really well.
Yeah.
So, thank you so much. Thank all of you so much for coming, and Dr. Bavery for coming and sharing some of her research in progress. And I want to thank you for bearing with our projector problem that we're having with the light bulb. I'm sorry about that. Unfortunately, I don't believe that anyone would have come in time for us to have this lecture to change the light bulb. Otherwise, I would have acted. So we are where we are with that. I think that I'm going to go ahead and bring the formal part to a close, but I know some people maybe brought some stuff they wanted to share, or talk to each other, or talk to Dr. Bavery about, and we are open to that. You know, she's available if anybody wants to stay for a little bit and talk. And I want to thank you again for coming. And if anybody wants to get more information about Pucci office events in the future, we do have this sign-in sheet here. Yes, I'm Thank you.
Thank you.